One of the questions that naturally arises at this time of year is, well, is the Christmas story actually true? Or is it just a myth or a fairy tale? Well, as a Christian, obviously I believe it is true. But you might be surprised to hear that I don't believe that just because of blind faith, but because of real, genuine evidence. The Christmas story is a matter of historical record, as reported by eyewitnesses who were there on the scene, people like Mary herself, who either wrote down what they saw or passed it on to others who wrote it down, just like people today do. And I get that it's hard to accept all of the supernatural, miraculous parts of the story, but when Jesus grew up, he proved again and again that he really was God's son. He healed the sick, he calmed the storm, he even rose again from the dead. And again, all of this was recorded by eyewitness testimony. So for me, and millions of Christians around the world, these things are not just a matter of faith, but of historical fact, as much as any past event. But when speaking about this, I think there are perhaps two common objections that are worth addressing. Now, firstly, people might ask, well, how can we know that any of this was true to begin with? How can we know that these eyewitnesses weren't just making it all up? And then secondly, we might say, well, how can we really be sure of these eyewitness accounts? How can we know they haven't been changed over time? How can we know that what they wrote is the same as what we are reading today? And so let's just take a look at both of those questions in turn. Now, firstly, how can we know that the witnesses didn't just make all of this up? Well, I think for two reasons. Because the events of the New Testament are public events. Things like the feeding of the 5,000, for example, or even Jesus' resurrection, are recorded as taking place at a specific time, in a specific place. The resurrection took place during the governorship of Pontius Pilate. If those things didn't happen in the way that the gospel writers described them, then it would have been easy for people to have contradicted them. And don't forget that both the Roman and the Jewish authorities were desperate to stamp out this new Christian sect. So if there were people going around with evidence that the Christians were just making this all up, they would have been certain to have made sure that this news got heard. And also it's worth knowing that almost all of Jesus' closest followers died some pretty horrendous deaths. So ask yourself, would you suffer and die for something that you knew was a lie, when you could simply save your life by owning up and telling the truth? I know what I would do. So secondly then, perhaps it wasn't a lie, but perhaps it was originally true, but it was changed over time. And maybe the original writings just didn't contain all of these supernatural elements, but over the last 2,000 years, some scribes or copywriters, made some mistakes, or maybe they embellished the story to make it more exciting. But actually, that's highly unlikely to be the case. There are copies of the New Testament that date all the way back to about 100 AD, which is remarkably close to when they were actually written. And if you take those copies and compare them to editions of the Bible that you can pick up in your local bookstore today, you'll see that there are very few differences at all. The scribes were clearly meticulous in their copying. So actually, if you pick up a Bible today, you can be almost certain that what you're reading is what the original author actually wrote almost 2,000 years ago. And so it's because of this that I believe Christmas It's more than just a myth. It's more than just a nice story. But I believe it's history. And more than that, it's the most important event in all of history. There's a reason why our entire calendar revolves around it. Because it was the most world-changing event in history. So I'd encourage you to think about it, explore it, find out what Christmas means. And this Christmas, just take a moment to think about the significance of this most world-changing event.